My last video ended with me kind of throwing up my hands on this Marantz 2252. I have a channel imbalance problem, and as near as I can tell, it seems to originate in the preamp or tone board here. But that's as close as I got. In part, the issue with diagnosing the problem is that it's an intermittent problem, that it sometimes isn't so bad and sometimes is worse, and it seems to come and go. It seems to come and go with sometimes moving the chassis around. So that kind of problem seems to kind of scream out broken solder weld, broken joint. That's, on the one hand, a relatively straightforward thing to address. You just got to resolder the joint. On the other hand, very difficult problem to isolate because broken solder joints can be simply very fine cracks. In this case, if there is a connection that is bad, it's not completely bad. That is, some signal is still getting through. So if it's a cracked joint, it's clearly not a very big crack. I've given this board a look relatively briefly under the magnifying lens, and I can't find anything that says I'm cracked. Now, in general, one of the things that I do in restoring a vintage piece is to resolder every joint in that piece. That is, I go at every joint with the solder sucker, pull off the solder, and then put in new solder. Another approach might simply be to retouch every joint, sort of reflow every one. That's not necessarily a bad way to go, but it's harder to track your progress. It's easier to miss stuff because usually when you use fresh solder, there's going to be a bit more of a contrast and you can tell what you have done and what you haven't done more easily. That, I think, is my next move here, is to simply go over this board, remove the old solder, put on new solder, and see if there's an improvement. Again, it's going to be a bit difficult to find that improvement or not because the problem is inconsistent. But ideally, I do that and I've got perfectly superimposed signals coming in and perfectly superimposed signals going out. Now, that does seem kind of unlikely, just given that in any stereo amplifier, you've got two amplifiers, and this was made in 1977. And during that amount of time, component values can drift, and they can drift asymmetrically. And so you might expect to get a little bit of variation in the signals coming out of an amplifier. What you don't expect is for that variation to vary radically moment to moment based on simply moving a chassis around. So again, this is something that I would generally do in the course of restoring an amplifier. I'm going to try it in this case as a fix for this one. So here's the newly resoldered board. Here's the signal going into the preamp. So here's the signal coming out. $153 millivolts on channel A, 161 millivolts on channel B. So that's not really an improvement on the best case before, but at least it's not as bad as the worst case before. I'll just check the other channel one more time. So 160 millivolts versus 153 millivolts. Question is there anything I can do to make it change? 88.5 on channel A, 93.7 on channel B. Oh, something just changed there. Channel B had been the higher amplitude. It was 93.6 or 7, I believe. Now it's down at 81, 82, 83, 84. So maybe my shifting this around did have some effect. Huh. Look at that. Just jiggling it, went up to 87 point something. It's going up again, 88 point something. The two signals are now very close together. And as I sit here and watch, it's going up. So channel A is just rock steady there at 88.5 millivolts. Channel B seems to vary. Now it's up to 92.8. So it had gone down to 82, now it's up to 92, 93. Where's the touchy bit? Whoa. I affected it. Well. Pushed on a capacitor next to the tape monitor switch. Oh, no, it's not the capacitor. It's that I slip off the capacitor and hit the tape monitor switch. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's something with that switch. And of course, what I don't know is whether the problem is with, say, a connection between the switch and the board, or a connection within the switch itself. So what I'm looking for right now is there any way to get some deoxit in there to clean up that switch, so that if the problem is a connection within the switch itself, then perhaps that could solve the problem, so that I wouldn't have to resolder the joints on the back of that board. But those switches are pretty well enclosed. There's some exposure of plastic mechanism at the bottom, but I don't necessarily believe that shooting deoxit in there is going to have any particular effect. I found a sticky on audiokarma.org on the Marantz forum, and this is of course a known problem with these tape monitor switches, and the mono switches can also cause problems. And the sticky tells how to take this apart. It also strongly urges caution. This white piece here, that runs the length of the switch, and there are little contacts, sort of staple-shaped contacts on the side of it, and they've got little bitty springs in there. They're spring-loaded so that they contact whatever's on the outside of the switch, the opposing contacts. And those little springs can go flying, and you lose them, and then good luck. So there's this one metal piece that sort of holds this bit together, and it's got like a little knuckle there that the spring hooks onto. A little bit hard to get it from the front, but from the back it's not so bad. Just lifts off of it pretty easily. So what I need to do then is manipulate this metal bit here. So that's interesting. Now I gotta find that little piece. That's a promising start, isn't it? It should just pull straight out now. Just need to be real careful in doing so. Shit. Probably should right now try to find that piece that went flying. I didn't see, but I could hear. It seemed to land inside here. So not seeing it. So I'm going to pick up the unit, see if I can find it that way. I see it. Phew. These are little itsy bitsy springs that you gotta be real careful about. So this is 2000 grit sandpaper that I'm using. Let's try it this way. So one thing I'm going to try, see if I can stretch this spring just a little bit. Just checking the springiness, how tightly that seems to bounce back versus the other side. Alright, as tough as that was, I'm going to do the other one. I think stretching that spring might be a pretty worthwhile thing to do. Okay, it's back together. And now comes the next tricky part. Not getting this back in, getting that little metal piece that had previously flown away back in the right spot. So that's got the one. I'm thinking I won't try to push my luck and do any of the other switches right now. First, see if that might have fixed the problem entirely. So we're back on the Marantz 2252, and I want to show you something here. So I've got the signal coming in from my phone here, going to the aux inputs up here. And I'm probing here at the volume knob, volume pot, and this is the input to the volume knob. Sorry, I keep saying knob. Input to the volume potentiometer. And there's our waveform. Very nice waveform. Seeing two waveforms superimposed very, very nicely there. And of course that won't change whatever the setting I have on the volume knob. I can turn it, right now it's actually all the way down because this is the input. I can turn it all the way up and nothing happens. Of course. So now let's look at the output from the volume knob. Sorry, the volume pot. Alright, so now we see zero output, which is as expected because it's turned all the way down. Let's turn it up. Blowing up the signal on the scope. Yeah, this is what I was seeing yesterday and what I wanted to show you now. As I turn that volume down, the signals get more and more different. So this is the finest resolution vertically on the scope, 5 millivolts per division here. The higher amplitude one is the one that I was having difficulty with before, and that's essentially been fixed by fixing the tape monitor switch. And now I've got this weird waveform coming out of the volume pot. Again, it's mainly something that shows up particularly at low volume. I don't know whether there's anything that can be done at all about this. It's a significant difference at low volume. That's 3.5 millivolts. And the other is 4.9 millivolts. So this is a very low amplitude, very low volume. But it's a discrepancy nonetheless of something like 30% additional, greater amplitude on the one channel than the other. And as I crank up the volume, see the problem persists up to, right now we're at 30 millivolts. Crank it up some more. And the problem seems to start going away as we get up towards 100 millivolts. And now that we're up at 167 millivolts, the problem's nearly imperceptible. And I call it a problem. I could be a little less judgmental and simply call it a discrepancy. You want your signals to be the same, so this is going to be relatively high volume. Still, we're only looking at the input to or output from the volume pot. This may very well be into clipping at the output at the speaker jacks. But now, pretty much identical. 349 millivolts on channel A, 347, 346 on channel B. So very, very nearly identical. Here we are after another round of deoxit. I really didn't think this was going to have any effect. But dang, check it out. We're looking at the outputs from the volume pods. We're down at 3.6 millivolts. 3.6 millivolts on channel B. 3.5 millivolts on channel A. So that's looking pretty much perfect. Pretty amazing, given how far off they were. I had no expectation that more deoxit treatment in that pot was going to have any effect. Magic spray. So here we are at 211 millivolts on channel A. Let's check the other channel again. 215. Yeah. So slight discrepancy, as you would expect from the outputs of two different devices, because that volume pot is two ganged devices. Here we are, full volume, probably clipping at the output. 353 on channel B, 350 on channel A. Wow. I think I had called it all good on this Marantz 2252. Had it all back together, decided, let me just check the outputs with everything put back together on the scope. So I did that. And there were some issues. In particular, the loudness switch isn't so great. The loudness switch tends to cut one of the channels down by a good fraction unless it's messed with. I thought I could get by with just fixing that one tape monitor switch, that is, cleaning the contacts. I'm going to have to do, I think I better do all of them, which is going to be a trick. So I'm going to do some futzing here to try to safeguard things a little bit. Keep things from flying across the room and onto the floor and all that kind of stuff. Probably use some masking tape to set up fences. See if that works all right, maybe. And we'll see how it goes. So wish me luck. Getting these switches back together is just a friggin' nightmare. So the problem is those little silver things fiddle back and forth to keep it locked in or out. And getting those in through the front is just, I have not found a good way to do it. And so they have to go in from above, which is a problem if there's stuff above them. So I unscrewed the front, these screws here and here, so that I could push this back a bit, and then took off the nut that holds the volume knob in place, pushed that back, and forced some of the wires out of the way there so that I could come in and drop that in from above. it's such a hassle. I think I'm going to not do all of them, so long as I don't have to. So, there we go. So that was the volume, so that was the loudness switch that I just did. And I'm hoping that's the last switch that I need to do, because I really don't want to do any of the others. So let's keep our fingers crossed and hope that all goes well. Alright, there we go. Nicely superimposed waveforms at a reasonable voltage here, looking at the speaker jacks. It does get slightly asymmetric as I turn it up. Still superimposed. I said asymmetric, I meant imbalanced. So there, as we get to... There's kind of this weird dead spot in the volume knob. Where it doesn't do anything. I'm moving the volume knob back and forth and it's not doing anything. And here, I'm moving it the same amount as I was when it wasn't doing anything. So you can see they're not completely superimposed here above 20 or 22.5 volts. Let's look at clipping. See, the one channel is clipping a bit on the bottom. It's not quite symmetric. And that I do mean symmetric. But looking good in general.